Okay, I'll be doing my thinking out loud uh for this textbook article, started from the generation of action potential. As it says, action potential or impulse is a sequence of occurring events that decrease and reverse the membrane potential, and then eventually store it into the resting state. Action potential has two main phases, a depolarizing phase and a repolarizing phase. During the depolarizing phase, the negative membrane potential becomes less negative, reaches zero, and then becomes positive. During the repolarizing phase, the membrane potential is stored in a resting rate of negative 70 millivolts. Following these repolarizing phase, they may be an after hyperpolarizing phase, during which the membrane potential temporarily becomes more negative than the resting level. Two types of voltage channels open and then close during the action potential. These channels are present mainly in the action plasma membrane and action terminal. The first channel that opened, the voltage gradient sodium channel, allows sodium to rush into the cell, which causes depolarizing phase. The voltage graded potassium channel allowing potassium to flow out, which produces repolarizing phase. The after hyperpolarizing phase occurs when the voltage graded potassium channel remain open for after the polarizing phase. The action potential occurs in the membrane of the axon of a neuron when the polarizing reaches a certain level termed the threshold, which is about negative 55 millivolts in many neutrons. Then moving down further, the paragraph also talks about subthreshold stimulus. An action potential will not occur in response to a subthreshold stimulus. A stimulus that is a weak depolarization, that cannot bring the membrane potential to a threshold. Going back to the other page, we can see figure 12.18 shows the action potential or impulse. It shows the depolarizing phase, repolarizing phase, and after hyperpolarizing phase, and it shows the stimulus. The purple portion of the graph shows resting membrane potential, voltage graded, and sodium channels are in a resting state, and voltage graded potassium channels are closed. The blue portion of the graph shows the stimulus causes depolarization to threshold. The green shows the voltage sodium channel activation and gates are open. The yellow shows the voltage graded potassium channels are open and any sodium channels are inactivated. And the orange portion shows the voltage gated potassium channel are still open and sodium channels are in the resting stage. The green and the yellow is the absolute refractory period, and the orange is the relative refractory period. Figure 12.19 shows the stimulus strength and action potential, as we can see right here. As you can see, the action potential in the first one, and the second one, which is the gray, and In the second graph, it shows that it is the threshold stimulus, that in order for the action potential to occur, it has to meet the threshold. The subthreshold stimulus, as we previously talked about, is weak depolarization. Then the super threshold stimulus we haven't talked about yet, which will be in the next page. It says here that the super threshold stimulus is stimulus strong enough to depolarize the membrane above threshold. The threshold stimulus is extremely strong enough to depolarize the membrane to threshold. Each action potential caused by the super threshold stimulus has the same amplitude size as an action potential caused by a threshold stimulus. Therefore, once an action potential is generated, the amplitude of the action potential is always the same and does not depend on the stimulus intensity. Instead, the greater the stimulus strength above threshold, the greater the frequency of the action potential until a maximum frequency is reached as determined by the absolute refractory period described shortly. Okay, as we can see here, the subthreshold, which is the weak depolarization, the middle one, which is the threshold stimulus, and we can see right here the super threshold stimulus. It doesn't go higher than the action potential, but it does have multiple waves along the graph to show that it's a super threshold stimulus, not just one, as we can see in the threshold stimulus. Moving on, depolarizing phase. As we talked about before, the depolarizing phase is also mentioned. As we talked about before, the depolarizing phase is when the negative becomes positive, when the negative membrane potential becomes less negative, reaches zero, and becomes positive. Okay, so it says right here, when a depolarizing gradient potential or some other stimulus causes the membrane of the action to depolarize to threshold, voltage gated sodium channel open rapidly. As it's previously talked about, as I said again, when the sodium channels open, it is the depolarizing phase. Moving on to the repolarizing phase. This is when the sodium channel is closed and the potassium channels are open. This is when, and as I stated before, repolarizing phase is the membrane potential is stored at the resting rate of -70 millivolts. Okay, then after that is the hyperpolarizing phase. Is when the potassium channels are still open, which causes an outflow of potassium large enough after a hyperpolarizing phase of the action potential. Stated before, is when during this hyperpolarizing stage, the membrane potential temporarily becomes more negative than the resting level. As we can see right here, it becomes more negative. You can see the curve under the resting membrane. Then the refractory period. Those are two periods. absolute refractory and relative refractory period. The refractory period is the period of time after an action potential begins during which an excitable cell cannot generate another action potential in response to normal threshold stimulus. Okay, and during the absolute refractory period is during that period, even a strong stimulus cannot initiate a second action potential. This period coincides with the period of sodium channel activation and inactivation. Moving on to the next page. Okay. As you can see, figure 12.20 shows the changes in ion flow throughout the voltage graded channels during the depolarizing and repolarizing phases of an action potential. The resting rate, as you can see right here. Then the depolarizing phase, as you can see, the sodium channel is open and the sodium are being let into the cell. The repolarizing phase, the sodium channel is closed and the potassium channel is open, letting the potassium out of the cell. Then we move to the repolarizing phase, which continues, and which is the more potassium flows, the more potassium flows, outflow continues. As more ions leave the neuron, more negative charge build up along the surface of the membrane. This shows the whole polarization. It's a flow chart. Then moving on to the last page, we talk about the propagation. We talk about the propagation. The propagation of action potential. This is a mode of conduction. Is called the mode of propagation is an action potential that keeps its strength as it spread along the membrane. This mode of conduction is called propagation, and it depends on positive feedback. As we learned already, when sodium flows in, they cause the voltage graded sodium channels in the adjacent segment of the membrane to open. Thus, that means the action potential travels along the membrane rather than like the activity of that long flow of dominoes. The actuality is it's not the same action potential that propagates along the entire axon. Moving on. We'll be talking about continuous conduction. The type of action potential propagation describes is continuous condition, which involves step-by-step depolarizing and repolarization of each adjacent segment of the plasma membrane. And it also talks about salutary conduction, which is the special mode of action potential propagation that occurs along the myelin axon occurs because of the uneven distribution of voltage graded channel. And this page also talks about the two consequences. The flow of current action of the membrane only at the nodes of Revenere has two consequences. The first one is the action potential appears to leap from node to node as each nodal area depolarizes. depolarizes to threshold, thus the name salutary. And the second, because of an action potential leaps across the long segment of the myelinated axonal lemma as current flows from one node to another, it travels much faster. It will in an unmyelated action of the same diameter. The second consequence is opening a smaller number of channels only at the nodes rather than the channels in each adjacent segment of the membrane, represents more energy efficient mode of conduction because only small regions of the membrane depolarize and repolarize. Minimal flow of sodium and outflow of potassium occurs each time an action potential passes by. Thus, less ATP is used by sodium-potassium pumps to maintain the low intracellular concentration of sodium and low extracellular concentration of potassium.